Thank you for joining us. Subscribe to our channel for more compelling tales of infidelity and its impact on marriages. Why do people engage in such destructive behavior, risking their families and their own lives? Today's story revolves around a husband's journey through the labyrinth of adultery. Will he emerge triumphant or succumb to the deceit of his unfaithful wife? Let's delve into the narrative. Our protagonist, Opus, stumbles upon a shattering secret that threatens the very foundation of his marriage. He is left in a state of shock when he witnesses his wife in the arms of another man. This devastating revelation leads to her abandoning their family, choosing to pursue a life with her newfound lover. As we delve deeper into this captivating narrative, I hope you find yourself engrossed in the intricate details. Now, let's shift our focus to Jim and myself, concluding our shift at the factory and embarking on our shared journey home. Driving home, Jim requested a stop at a nearby pharmacy to pick up a prescription for his ailing wife. Coincidentally, this was where my wife, Rachel, worked. Inspired by the spontaneity of the moment, I decided to surprise both Jim and Rachel with a visit. Despite Rachel's years of employment, I had never once visited her workplace. Visiting Rachel at the pharmacy was always a delicate matter for me. I didn't want to create the wrong impression among her colleagues or superiors. Surprisingly, Rachel had never expressed any desire for me to visit her during work hours. However, today was different. I knew that my unexpected appearance would take her by surprise and would indeed be a pleasant one. Rachel only worked at the pharmacy 2 days a week. After 6 years on the job, I felt it was time to get to know her boss. Our 9 years of marriage had been comfortable, although we weren't wealthy. My steady income from the factory provided us with a good living. Initially, Rachel stayed home after our marriage. However, after 2 years, she expressed a desire to start working. She wanted to be independent and have her own car. In the end, she convinced me to support her decision, especially since her earnings would contribute to the purchase of the desired car. A week after our agreement, she got a job at a pharmacy on the opposite side of town. Over a year passed, and Rachel proudly gave birth to our daughter, Sandy. After Sandy's birth, Rachel decided to become a stay-at-home mom for the next 2 years, devoting herself to raising her child. As Sandy grew older, Rachel approached me again, expressing a desire to return to work, even if it was just a couple of days a week. She had already contacted her previous employer, Mr. Clarkson, at the pharmacy, and he had agreed to take her on part-time. After much deliberation, I agreed, and Rachel arranged for her mother to look after Sandy on the days she would be working. For the past 3 years, Rachel had worked diligently 2 days a week under Mr. Clarkson's supervision. Surprisingly, I had never once visited her workplace, even though Sandy was almost 6 years old. Jim and I entered the pharmacy, a room not large but equipped with all the essentials of a drugstore. There were 4 long aisles lined with shelves, stocked with a wide variety of items ranging from various brands of cough syrup to other necessary medications. In the back of the store, we saw a room dedicated to prescriptions. Naturally, Jim and I headed there, anticipating seeing Rachel. However, to our surprise, there was only a middle-aged man behind the counter. He quickly took the prescription from Jim and began to fill it. I decided to introduce myself and ask where Rachel was, but I hesitated with Jim standing next to me. I didn't want to reveal my confusion at her absence, so I remained silent. Meanwhile, the pharmacist, absorbed in his immediate business, was diligently processing Jim's prescription. Sensing an opportune moment, Jim began browsing the various displays scattered throughout the store. Seizing the moment, I stealthily approached the back of the pharmacy. My gaze fell on a table against the wall, immediately drawn to a framed photograph of a little girl about 7 or 8 years old hanging on the wall. The resemblance between the child in the photograph and my own daughter, Sandy, was striking. The little girl had the same flowing golden curls and piercing blue eyes as Sandy, even her smile was similar. I stood stunned, scrutinizing the photograph. The uncanny resemblance made me feel like I was seeing Sandy's future appearance. A wave of curiosity washed over me. I mustered up the courage to ask the pharmacist, who was still busy counting pills, if the child in the picture was his daughter. To my surprise, he shook his head and replied, "No, I only have 2 boys at home. That's Katie, Mr. Clarkson's daughter." His words echoed in my head as I took another look at the photograph. Katie was indeed such a sweet child. I was speechless for a moment, pretending to be interested in some object on a nearby shelf, slowly stepping back, trying to collect my thoughts. A deep uneasiness settled in me, a nauseous feeling stirring in the back of my mind. How could it be that this Katie looked so strikingly like my own daughter? And where was my wife? A foreboding feeling prickled me, hinting at disturbing answers to these questions. But I was not yet ready to face and accept them. Feeling an urgent need to escape, I made my way to Jim and quietly told him I would wait for him in the car. As I sat alone with my thoughts, it became increasingly clear to me that Sandy looked nothing like me or Rachel. This realization only made me more anxious. Rachel and I had similar facial features, brown eyes and dark brown hair. However, Sandy's hair had been a bright blonde color in her early childhood. I remembered the joking conversations of my friends who would banter about the fact that I often ordered pizza at home or quibble about the color of the mailman's hair. These light-hearted remarks never bothered me, as I was well aware that it was all in jest. But now, these innocent jokes resurfaced and began to haunt me. Doubts gnawed at me non-stop. Was Sandy really my daughter, or was she Mr. Clarkson's child? Uncertainty overwhelmed me, making me question the very basis of my identity as her father. I found it particularly odd that I had never crossed paths with Carl Clarkson, so I knew nothing about his appearance other than that he had blonde hair. That evening, Rachel noticed my silent and pensive mood. Concerned, she asked if something was bothering me. Naturally, I didn't tell her about my visit to her workplace and the thoughts that plagued me. I really wanted to know where she was during my unexpected visit, but I kept my doubts at bay. I understood the need for caution, realizing the delicacy of the situation. Instead of jumping to conclusions and blaming Rachel for something that could only exist in my imagination, I realized the importance of looking for concrete evidence that could confirm or dispel my doubts about my daughter's parentage. The mere thought that my beloved Angel was not my biological child was incredibly agonizing. My love for her was boundless, and for her sake, I was willing to go to any length. Trying to rationalize the situation, I desperately clung to the idea that the similarities between the 2 girls could be nothing more than a coincidence. But before I could allow myself further doubt, I needed to gather convincing evidence. Despite that, I still had a lingering suspicion in the back of my mind. It lurked, refusing to be ignored. When night fell and I was in bed beside my wife, the weight of the day's events came over me with all its force. If Carl Clarkson was her biological father, that meant Rachel had been deceiving me from the beginning. From the moment she'd started working for him 6 years ago, I'd been under the impression that she was still involved with her lover. It was like she had been deceiving me all these years. Every time she came home after spending time with her boss, I couldn't help but think that she enjoyed the thought that she had safely deceived me. I had already noticed her suspicious behavior when she got home. She would shower, claiming that she needed to wash off the persistent odor of the various chemicals she had come in contact with. It was clear to me that she was in a hurry to shower to eradicate all traces of her recent adultery. The next day was Friday, and since Rachel didn't have to work, I decided to stop by her workplace after dropping Jim off at his house. I felt compelled to meet Carl Clarkson face to face. I'd never met him before, and he didn't know I existed, so I felt it was time to finally face him. After asking the receptionist where Mr. Clarkson was, I learned that he had already left. However, she suggested that his assistant, Mr. Mann, might be able to help me with my question. She gestured towards the back of the office. I immediately recognized the same man who had filled Jim's prescription the day before. I politely explained that I would come another time as I had a personal matter to discuss with Mr. Clarkson. At the same time, she suddenly told me not to come to the pharmacy on Tuesday or Thursday afternoons as he was always absent during those hours. Without saying a word in response, I just nodded, signaling that I understood the situation. As I got into the car, I mumbled to myself, realizing that I was completely confused. Rachel was hired to assist Mr. Clarkson on those particular 2 days, her duties including counting pills and helping to fill prescriptions. Interestingly, she constantly addressed him as Mr. Clarkson. That said, I had just learned that it was on the days that Rachel worked that he took the day off. This left me puzzled, questioning what Rachel was doing on those days. After all, her role was to assist her boss during those hours, but she was nowhere to be found. Maybe she was accompanying him somewhere else. After the birth of our daughter Sandy, I strongly objected to her going back to work. Despite this, she persisted and eventually, I reluctantly agreed. Now, I was haunted by a heavy feeling about her work and the image of the picture of our child on her desk. Doubts about my wife's fidelity grew stronger every day. Was she having an affair with her boss, or were these suspicions a figment of my overactive imagination? I was determined to gather evidence of Rachel's infidelity. Spending the weekend with her at home had turned into a nightmare for me. Every time I looked at her, I couldn't help but think that she was having a secret affair with her boss. Unfortunately, I didn't have a clear picture of him, which made me even more upset. In the back of my mind, I felt that Sandy, our daughter, might not be biologically mine. This suspicion never left me, and I began to speculate that Rachel had been cheating on me behind my back all this time. Maybe she was carrying her lover's second child. She seemed to be cheating on me far more often than I realized. Every time I thought of her, my anger rose to the surface. It became impossible to see her without feeling a deep frustration that fueled my determination to get to the truth. On Saturday morning, as she slept peacefully beside me, I watched her quietly. She was undoubtedly a beautiful woman, but the thought of her possible betrayal weighed on me, drowning out any admiration. Throughout the morning, we didn't exchange a single word, maintaining an awkward silence. As the three of us gathered around the table, I noticed that I was talking mostly to my daughter, deliberately avoiding Rachel. That night, I woke her abruptly in the middle of the night, wanting to reclaim what I felt was rightfully mine. There were no tender kisses or sweet words between us, but instead a rough and passionate intimacy. It was my way of getting revenge, punishing her for giving herself to another man. Strangely enough, Rachel never once protested or voiced her displeasure at my strange behavior. It looked like she had something to hide and was trying to placate me by allowing unlimited physical intimacy. After all, I had no concrete evidence of her cheating at the time. I couldn't explain the reason for my behavior. I only knew that I had a keen desire to hurt her. Perhaps her silent submission was due to fear, but what should she be afraid of? Her own husband, unless, of course, she had something to hide. All she seemed to want was for my anger to subside and for us to return to our usual domestic routine. I sensed that she was afraid to talk to me, as if she feared that I would discover her worst secret. In an attempt to find solace and keep her peace, she decided to submit to my demands and endure the humiliation I subjected her to every day. I became more and more convinced that she was having an affair with her boss. I now firmly believed that their illicit relationship had been going on for years. Throughout my life, I had always been a caring and attentive husband. I used to pride myself on being a caring and attentive husband to my wife. But now, I began to use her body solely to satisfy my own desires, completely ignoring her desires. The emotional connection between us was gone, and I stopped seeing her as a beloved partner. In some strange impulse, I sought retribution by being selfish and forceful during our intimate moments. I felt no remorse, believing that she deserved to be treated that way. As time went on, I began to notice a growing sense of anxiety and fear in her expression. One evening, I sat across from her at the kitchen table and watched her eat in silence. There was an undeniable tension in the air, and I sensed that she suspected that I had found out about her affair with Carl. She was hesitant to put the matter directly and to enter into an open conversation with me. I could not understand why she was so afraid, for I had never been a violent man. Perhaps she wasn't ready to end our marriage, wanting the security it provided and at the same time craving the thrill of her secret relationship. Determined to find out the truth, I decided to gather evidence of her adultery. To do so, I decided to take the following Tuesday off and follow her to her place of employment. I was firmly convinced that their meeting had not taken place at the pharmacy where she worked and concluded that they must have met elsewhere to deceive me. Consequently, I devised a plan to borrow Jim's truck for the day, which would allow me to follow her discreetly without attracting attention. Tuesday morning, I dressed in my usual work suit as if everything was business as usual. Then, I went to pick Jim up from his house, handing him my car keys in return. After picking up his car, I drove back home and parked at a few houses away so I could get a good view of my house. Not a few minutes later, I saw Rachel getting into her car accompanied by Sandy. I moved cautiously behind them as they made their way to Sandy's school, trying not to draw too much attention to myself. I watched my daughter get out of the car and head to school. Rachel, as before, drove straight to the drugstore. I parked Jim's car on the opposite side of the street and made myself comfortable, waiting quietly and listening to the soft tunes on the radio. Although I didn't know exactly what was in store for me, I was firmly convinced that some kind of exposure was bound to happen. From my seat, I had a good view of Rachel's red Toyota and the adjacent parking spaces near the pharmacy. I was determined to stay there all day if I had to. Just 30 minutes after Rachel entered the pharmacy, my attention was caught by a gorgeous black SUV maneuvering into the parking lot. The driver smoothly pulled into a spot adjacent to my wife's Toyota. A tall, perfectly dressed man of about 35 got out of the car. He opened a separate entrance adjacent to the parking lot that allowed access to the pharmacy. As soon as I saw him getting out of the car, I was struck by lightning, realizing that he was the father of the girl in the pictures I had seen before. It all made sense now. This man was most likely not only my wife's lover but also Sandy's biological father. For 6 long years, he had deceived me by playing the role of a stranger, hiding from view. A flash of anger coursed through my veins, fueling the urge to run after him and vent my rage. I was also strongly tempted to be violent with my wife, but I realized that such actions belonged to a period of emotional distress that had passed. I was 6 years too late to react to my anger. Perhaps if I had confronted her after the first or second instance of infidelity, there might have been a chance to save our marriage. But after 6 years of continuous cheating that happened maybe twice a week, any hope of reconciliation was gone. It was time to end our relationship with her and make them both answer for the consequences of their actions. Thoughts of revenge consumed me. I sat patiently in Jim's car until noon. Suddenly, the door opened, and Rachel and her lover came out of the building. As they left the building, smiles shone on their faces, like a satisfied couple. They got into his SUV and drove off. Following their black vehicle was not difficult, as my wife's lover expressed no desire to hurry. After 15 minutes of navigating, we found ourselves on a country road that led to a lake. Another 10 minutes passed, and I watched them turn determinedly toward the driveway of a charming log cottage located on the lake shore. Cautiously, I parked Jim's car a half-mile from their spot, concealing my presence. I walked quietly toward the cottage, noticing the tall and neatly trimmed cedar hedge that surrounded the grounds. Fortunately, the barrier shielded me from prying eyes, ensuring the complete privacy of my observations. Cautiously, I began to leisurely walk around the house until I heard sounds coming from an open window on the left side of the cottage. Cautiously approaching it, I was soon able to peer through the partially ajar window, which was as high as my shoulders. There was a dim illumination inside, from which my eyes had to adjust for a moment. After a few seconds, I realized what was happening in the room. I recognized the silhouettes of a man and a woman engaged in intimate acts on the bed. They were completely immersed in their desires, lost in pleasure. As I focused on the man's face, it became apparent that he bore a striking resemblance to Sandy, my daughter. The thin nose, hair color, and eyes all matched her face perfectly. In an instant, all doubt vanished. It was undeniable. Carl Clarkson was indeed Sandy's biological father. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. Carl Clarkson, my wife's lover, was the father of Sandy, my only daughter. All these years, my wife had lied to me, making me believe I was her biological father. And she and Carl had laughed at my stupidity. In their eyes, I must have been the epitome of stupidity, unwittingly raising someone else's child. The betrayal hurt me deeply, and I couldn't help but wonder if they were already planning another child together. Despite the shock and pain, one thing remained unwavering: I loved my daughter. She was and always will be my daughter in my heart. No one could take that love away from me. Yet, to see my wife having intimate relations with another man was an overwhelming shock to me. It was a sight I would not wish on any husband. I was overwhelmed with anger and sadness, although I must admit that it brought out some unexpected emotions in me. At that moment, I was at a loss, not knowing what to do next. Tears streamed down my face, and I was overcome with self-pity. It only made me angrier at both of them. I regretted not bringing my camera, because it would have been concrete proof of her betrayal. At that point, I decided that filing for divorce was my only option. I knew I needed irrefutable proof of her infidelity to present to the judge, which would strengthen my position and increase my chances of getting custody of Sandy. Seeing the woman I had once loved engage in secret liaisons with another man was unbearable for me. I could no longer watch their actions or hear their voices. Silently, I returned to the car, wanting to distract myself from the painful scene unfolding before my eyes. The love I had once felt for her was all but gone. Instead, my soul was filled with a thirst for revenge against her and her lover. The events that followed would forever define their lives. That evening, Rachel came home at the usual time after a long day at work. Without saying a word, she went upstairs to take a refreshing shower, while I busied myself with preparing dinner for our family, which was a regular occurrence on the day she worked. Our conversation was sparse, but we both gave our full attention to Sandy, who eagerly talked about how she had spent the day at school. The next morning was Wednesday, and Rachel had the day off work. She put on her robe and joined Sandy and me at the breakfast table to share a meal together. From time to time, I caught glances from her when she thought I was busy eating. There was a strange expression on her face that spoke volumes. I guessed that she suspected that I had found out about her illicit affair with her boss. I even caught a hint of fear in her gaze. When evening came and Rachel was busy cleaning up the dishes in the kitchen, I decided to share a story with her, albeit a fictional one. I told the story of a fictional factory employee who had recently shocked his wife by catching her with another man. I described how he attacked his wife after learning of her infidelity. I also mentioned that his co-workers at the factory were plotting to punish her lover. Rachel listened in silence, her eyes widening with each word. Finally, she turned to me and asked if I thought such behavior was justified. I calmly explained to her that a woman had no right to betray her husband like that, emphasizing the seriousness of the affair and its consequences. It was just and right that both the wife and her lover be punished for treating the sanctity of marriage with great disrespect. When Tuesday came, I again took the day off and borrowed Jim's truck. At noon, sitting in my car, I had lunch, after which I proceeded with my plan. This time, I drove to a cottage on the shores of a quiet lake, knowing full well that Carl's black SUV would be parked out front. Armed with a video camera, I prepared to capture irrefutable proof of their infidelity. This proof was necessary not only to gain custody of Sandy but also to reveal the truth to Carl's unsuspecting wife. I wanted to hurt him as much as possible. He would pay dearly for the thrill of his illicit affair with my wife. At one time, I had considered doing DNA tests on both myself and Sandy, intending to use it as conclusive evidence of her infidelity. But I soon realized that even if I could prove that I was not Sandy's biological father, it would give my wife the opportunity to take Sandy away from me in court. Instead, I decided to pretend I didn't know this fact, hoping that the videotape of their intimate encounters would be proof enough. Once again, like last time, they were engrossed in their playful antics on the bed. But this time, I was videotaping every intimate detail. While discreetly filming their actions, I overheard Carl talk about his intentions to make sure his wife could never get her driver's license, which would prevent her from following him later. Rachel confided to Carl that I had been acting strange the past few days. She was overcome with an unsettling fear, suspecting I might be aware of their illicit affair. I could sense Carl's growing nervousness. I realized I'd gotten enough footage of this insidious betrayal. I returned home, taking on the familiar role of cooking dinner while she was at work. She usually finished work at 6 o'clock and came home 15 minutes after the end of the day. It suddenly dawned on me that during these work hours, she and Carl must have been engaged in their secret trysts from 2:30 to 5:30 p.m., while I was diligently preparing meals for our family, unaware of the impending dissolution of our once friendly household. That evening, a decision formed in my mind. I would utilize the power of their shared fear of me. It is important to note that violence does not define my character. I must admit, however, that the fictitious story of the factory worker who resorted to violence when he learned of his wife's infidelity really shook her to the core. Combined with the newfound confidence and power I had over her body and soul, it probably played a significant role in creating the image she had of me at this point. I assumed that she was simply stalling for time, eagerly awaiting an event that would help her rid herself of our connection. Perhaps she was looking forward to the day when she could hand me the divorce papers, allowing her to find comfort in the arms of her lover forever. The following Wednesday at dinner, I broached the subject again, mentioning an unhappy husband from work. I recounted how he had finally taken revenge on the lover who had messed around with his unfaithful wife. I emphasized convincingly that this woman's lover was now lying in a hospital bed and receiving the punishment he deserved. Continuing to fan the flames of her fear, I revealed that the husband who betrayed her had initiated divorce proceedings, demanding custody of their children as well. I could feel Rachel's intense shock as she absorbed my words. She continued to eat in silence, but her trembling hands betrayed her inner turmoil. The next day, returning from a secret rendezvous, she was visibly nervous. From her transparent eyes to my observant gaze came fear. During dinner, I deliberately started a conversation about her work, subtly inquiring about her boss, his appearance, his family, and other details. Until that day, I had never been interested in her boss, so my sudden curiosity about him made her uncomfortable and me positive. I began to ask about her duties at the pharmacy and to find out how satisfied she was with her job. To reinforce her doubts and stoke her fears, I casually mentioned that I might one day surprise her with a visit to her workplace. Her face showed shock, but she remained silent with a strange expression on her face. She nodded slowly, unable to find the words. Over the weekend, I decided to take Rachel and Sandy out to dinner, trying to keep up the semblance of a loving family. But even Sandy could sense how her mother's behavior had changed over the past few weeks. My daughter sought comfort in me, directing her questions and seeking the comfort of an embrace solely in my presence. That evening, as we were nearing the end of our meal at the restaurant, Sandy excused herself to the restroom, leaving us alone. Taking advantage of the moment of privacy, I gently asked Rachel if something was bothering her and if she wanted to share her worries with me. "Understand me, dear Roger," she began, confusion and concern evident in her voice. "It's been a long time since you've been close to me. Tell me, when was the last time we made love?" Her gaze settled on me, concern reflected on her face. It was obvious that she was starting to feel remorse, but it was equally obvious that confessing her infidelity wasn't part of her plan. Even if she had apologized and confessed, I knew I couldn't forgive her. It was too late now. Her actions, not only against our marriage but also against Sandy, were unforgivable. Deep down, she realized it too. "You know I love you, Roger," she whispered, desperation sounding in her words. But lately, I don't see love in your eyes when you look at me. It feels like hate." Taking a deep breath, I met her gaze, unable to hold back any longer. "Tell me, Rachel, are you cheating on me? If so, then our relationship is over, and you will never see our daughter again. I can guarantee you that." With those firm words, I finally revealed the truth that had been weighing on my heart. The truth was revealed and hung in the air between us. Rachel's eyes met mine, and her face was shocked and speechless. I watched as tears came to her eyes, their appearance an unexpected display of her emotions. She abruptly grabbed her purse and ran out of the restaurant, leaving only an uncertain trail behind her. While Sandy was in the restroom, I settled the bill and waited patiently for her to join me. As I left the restaurant, I saw Rachel standing by the car, her eyes red with tears, but she couldn't cry anymore. The following Monday, I went to my supervisor and applied for a 2-week vacation. The gravity of the situation made me take a step back and evaluate my next steps. At first, my boss was hesitant when I asked for 2 weeks of vacation, but after explaining the seriousness of my family crisis, he agreed and acquiesced to my request. Toward evening that same day, I found myself in the parking lot at Carl's house, contemplating my next steps. Sitting in my car, I pondered the unknown ahead of me, not knowing the exact plan. I felt I had to finally meet Carl's wife and tell her the truth. I caught a glimpse of her in the backyard by the pool, and it strengthened my resolve. The woman was taller than Rachel, and her light brown hair looked like my wife's. With all my strength, I got out of the car and walked to the fence entrance. With bated breath, I slowly made my way across the backyard, watching her rearrange the chairs around the pool. Finally, reaching her, I introduced myself in a trembling voice. "I'm Roger Weldon, and my wife Rachel works alongside your husband at the pharmacy," I began, my tone reflecting the gravity of the situation. Her gaze froze in unusual tension for a moment, and then a smile appeared on her lips. She held out her hand, accepting my introduction. "Yes, of course, I've heard of Rachel, although we've never met." "Claudine Clarkson," she replied with a warm smile, and our hands intertwined in a friendly greeting. At that moment, it became clear to me that she knew nothing of her husband's affair with my wife. As I considered the gravity of the truth I was about to share with her, I realized that there was no escaping the devastating effect this revelation would have on her. Nevertheless, she deserved to know the real story. With a sense of urgency, I decided it would be best to go directly to her and get straight to the point. "I apologize for the sudden nature of this meeting, Mrs. Clarkson," I began, my tone reflecting the gravity of the situation. "I have something to tell you, and I know it will cause you great pain. Your husband and my wife are in a long-standing love affair." The words hung in the air as she stood before me with a frozen expression of shock on her face. For a few silent moments, she stared at me intently, her mouth slightly ajar. Then, like a fragile dam, tears appeared in the corners of her eyes. She stood motionless, unable to utter a word, until finally, stunned, she put both hands to her mouth in bewilderment. Before I could recount all that had happened, however, she interrupted me, gathering strength and asking if I had any physical proof of my words. "Yes," I replied firmly. "I have proof of their affair. I have photographs of them together at your lakeside cottage, and I'm afraid more evidence could be found. Their relationship lasted more than 6 years." As soon as those words escaped my lips, they were followed by another horrifying revelation. "In addition, I strongly suspect that your husband is the biological father of my daughter." The gravity of this statement made Claudine lose her composure. A fit of tears came over her, and I quickly helped her into the house. As I walked her to the couch, I waited patiently, giving her a few minutes to recover from her tumultuous emotions. Taking a seat in front of her, I carefully pulled a picture of my daughter out of my wallet and held it out to Claudine. "This is Sandy, my daughter," I began, noticing Sandy's obvious resemblance to her husband. "Note her striking resemblance to your husband, same blonde hair, same thin nose, high cheekbones. Moreover, She bears a striking resemblance to your own daughter, I continued, turning my attention to the photograph of her daughter hanging on the mantelpiece. Rising from my seat, I picked it up and carefully placed both pictures side by side on the coffee table in front of her. "Look at that undeniable resemblance, Mrs. Clarkson," I asked, emphasizing the connection between our daughters. "Indeed, the resemblance between our daughters is striking. It is clear to anyone who sees them that they could be twins. The evidence speaks for itself, and it is clear that they are sisters related by blood." Claudine's tears stopped after this discovery. She clutched both pictures tightly in her hands and stared at them. After a moment, she raised her eyes to me and asked with desperation, "What are we going to do?" Taking a pause to collect my thoughts, I firmly replied, "Personally, I have decided to divorce my wife and get custody of my daughter." Realizing the gravity of our situation, I acknowledged that this was likely the only fair and just decision for both of us. After being tormented by doubts for some time, I finally saw the harsh reality. Carl really was cheating on me. As the man responsible for the laundry, the proof had been in my hands all along. He will not get away with this betrayal. He will pay for his actions. "Mrs. Clarkson," I strongly suggested, "I suggest you contact a lawyer if you wish. I can provide you with copies of the photographs I have of their intimate relationship, but we should wait a few days before disclosing their affair. There's a strategic reason for this approach, and I'll explain it to you." I got the tape out of the car, and we watched part of it together. Claudine continued to cry, overwhelmed with emotion. After a few minutes, she asked me to stop the tape, wanting a break from the unbearable truth unfolding before her eyes. After Claudine had managed to regain her composure, I proceeded to outline my intentions and plans. I suggested that we both wait a few days before informing the couple of what we knew about their affair. With a heavy heart, she reluctantly agreed to this course of action. On Tuesday, I sought the advice of my attorney, sharing with him the photographs I had received of the unfaithful wife. However, the lawyer explained that getting custody of Sandy would not be easy, especially since I am not her biological father. He warned that if my wife demanded a DNA test and proved that I was not Sandy's biological father, it could significantly weaken my argument. Given the advice of an attorney and the possible consequences, I realized that a child support lawsuit against Carl would likely result in the loss of custody of Sandy, an outcome I desperately wanted to avoid. Upon realizing this, I made the decision to stop any legal action for the time being. Realizing the need to take matters into my own hands, I decided to devise a plan that would force my wife to leave our home and voluntarily relinquish custody of Sandy in my favor. This became my new goal, and I began to chart a complicated path to ensure my daughter's safety and well-being. If I could somehow convince my wife to go away with her lover, even if only for a short time, it might play in my favor. By doing so, she would create a dubious situation that would call into question her ability to gain custody of our daughter in the event of our divorce. At this point, no DNA tests had been done, providing no concrete evidence that I was not Sandy's biological father. It dawned on me that the judge would not look favorably on a mother who was having an affair with another man. When Rachel came home from work that afternoon, I noticed clear signs of her cheating. Her lips were slippery and moist, indicating that she had been intimate. When Rachel found out that I knew about her secret affair, tears streamed down her face, and she began to apologize to me. She tried to talk to me, expressing her remorse and repeating that she was sorry for what she had done. I remained silent, offering no words of comfort or response. Sensing my indifference, she began to say that she would end her affair with Carl and quit her job. She claimed to love only me and begged me to forgive her, promising to redeem herself. But it was quite obvious to me that she was lying. Hearing the derogatory remarks she made about me while at the cottage with her lover, I realized that she had no sincere intention of leaving him. Despite her attempts to buy time, it was becoming painfully clear that Rachel had made the decision to leave me for Carl. The only thing keeping her from leaving immediately was Sandy. In her fear of my immediate reaction, to get Rachel to run off with her boss, I realized I needed to increase her fear. I wanted her to fear not only for her own safety but also for the safety of her lover. In a calm tone, I made it clear that forgiveness was out of the question. I explicitly warned her that my revenge on her and Carl would be excruciatingly painful. In doing so, I deliberately left out the fact that I was not Sandy's biological father. Later that afternoon, I honored my recommendation and drove to Claudine's home. She sought legal advice from the same lawyer I had hired. Claudine told me that her lawyer had already made significant progress on the divorce papers for both of us. She also told me that her husband had been acting strangely for the past 24 hours. She had noticed him discreetly loading boxes into his SUV, unaware that she was watching him from the yard. From this, she concluded that he was secretly planning to abandon the family. I reassured Claudine, explaining that this unexpected development could be good for her. If her husband decided to leave them, it would greatly improve her chances of obtaining custody of her daughter. I emphasized that by abandoning his family, he would jeopardize everything. Such actions would reflect poorly on him in the eyes of a judge if it came to that. Naturally, Rachel didn't show up for work on Tuesday. She said she quit her job and vowed never to speak to Carl again. But I treated her promises with complete indifference. I knew she was lying, and the truth was that I wasn't going to stay married to her for long. That afternoon, I watched her discreetly as she gathered her things from the dressing room. It became clear to me that she too intended to leave me soon. Nevertheless, I was determined not to let her take Sandy with her. To reinforce her already strong desire to run away with her lover, I made a deliberate choice to further fuel her fear. That same day, I told her of my plan to deal with Carl the following week. When she inquired about the fate of our marriage, I simply said that once I dealt with her lover, I would decide what to do with her. When I looked into her eyes, her silent gaze reflected unmistakable terror. It is important to note that violence does not come naturally to me. In the weeks leading up to this revelation, I had always treated our relationship with tenderness, both in and out of the bedroom. But when I learned that she had broken our marriage vows over 6 years ago and was continuing to do so, the love I had once felt for her dissolved into thin air. I transformed into a different person, a person racked with sadness and anger. It is important to note that this transformation did not lead me to violence but rather a deep emotional distress. The next day, I walked Sandy to school and tried to talk to the person in charge of her education. I approached the principal of the school where Sandy attends and urgently explained the seriousness of the situation. I made it clear that my wife intended to run away with another man and possibly even kidnap our daughter. I emphasized that under no circumstances would I allow Sandy to leave the school grounds with my wife or anyone else without my express permission. To ensure Sandy's safety, I devised a plan whereby each day, I would personally drive her to school and ask her to wait inside until I returned for her. This way, she would be under the school's tight security until I arrived. After picking Sandy up from school, I returned home, knowing full well that my wife was on the verge of running away from me. I drove to Claudine's house in the evening, knowing full well that my absence would likely force my wife to use the phone to contact Carl. I was glad for the opportunity, since I was counting on them to carry out their plan to elope together. My main desire was to cut my wife out of my life and get as far away from Carl as possible. Filing divorce papers with an unfaithful wife was no longer an option, as there was a significant risk that she would use the legal process to take Sandy away from me. Instead, I planned to create circumstances that would force her to run away with Carl, eventually leaving her daughter behind. Even if it meant moving to the other side of the country with my daughter for just a few days, I was determined to make it happen. If my wife and Carl carried out their plan, arriving at Claudine's house, I saw her in tears. She told me that Carl had taken almost all of his belongings without explaining the reason for his sudden departure. It was clear to me that he was waiting for a convenient moment when I wasn't home to meet Rachel. My first priority, however, was to make sure they didn't take Sandy with them. Without hesitation, I immediately drove to the school where Sandy was attending. To my horror, as soon as I pulled up, I noticed Carl's car driving slowly past the school. To my horror, I saw Carl accompanied by my wife, who had noticed me parking my car outside the school. Realizing that they had been spotted, they hurriedly drove away. Fortunate, my daughter was still on the school grounds. I picked up Sandy and drove her home. Later, I talked to Sandy and gently explained that her mother would have to be away for a while, as she had to visit a sick relative. I reassured her that everything would be all right and, at the same time, shielded her from the harsh truth about her mother's actions. The next day, I took the necessary precautions and changed all the locks on the doors of my house. Then, I met with my lawyer and informed him that Rachel had left her family and gone into hiding with her lover. I then contacted a real estate agent to ask for the necessary assistance in selling the house as soon as possible, specifying that it was in my name only. Knowing that the paperwork would not be a problem, I stated that I needed to sell the house immediately. That evening, I contacted Claudine, and I heard on the other end of the phone that she was in tears. She tearfully told me that Carl had left a note on her bed. In the note, he said that he had fallen in love with someone else, which had prompted him to leave the marriage. In addition, he said that he had consulted his lawyer the week before, which had resulted in the house and cottage being transferred solely in her name. He had also left her a small sum of money deposited in the bank. Overwhelmed with sympathy, I could not help feeling a sense of responsibility for the sad circumstances that had befallen her. Afterward, I explained to her that my daughter Sandy was very much affected by her mother's absence from her home. As I was about to place my order for a huge pizza and salad, I persuaded her to bring Katie along so they could join us for dinner. To my surprise, not 15 minutes later, Claudine and Katie graced us with their presence in my home. As I later recalled, inviting them to dinner turned out to be one of the best decisions of my life. A wonderful friendship developed between my daughter and Katie, and they bonded quickly, which helped mitigate her mother's absence. Katie's presence was instrumental in filling some of the void left behind. Personally, I found solace and comfort in Claudine's company. Together, we spent an evening filled with warmth and companionship, experiencing moments of genuine pleasure and tranquility. Things progressed rapidly from there. Claudine and I formed a strong bond and became close friends. She made the decision to sell her cottage and house and moved in with me a few weeks later. Our relationship grew into that of a loving family with 2 beautiful daughters. To outsiders, it seemed like we were a married couple, happy and united. Realizing the need for a fresh start, I quickly got busy selling my home. I discussed with Claudine the importance of moving to a place where it would be difficult for our spouses to find us if they tried. Together, we planned a future where we could build a new life away from the past. Less than a month after Rachel left, I found myself in Texas with Claudine and our 2 girls. For many years, I had a successful career as a contractor and used my skills to build a beautiful home and a welcoming town. Gradually, I became convinced that this profession was lucrative and allowed me to thrive. I now have a staff of 5 people working under my supervision. It has been 5 years since Claudine and I moved to Texas. We are perceived in our community as a prosperous, happy married couple raising 2 daughters, Sandy and Katie. Just last year, we were blessed with the birth of our baby boy. Although we have not had contact with Rachel and Carl over the years, Claudine and I have not given up hope for their well-being. At the same time, we cherish the life we have built together. It's unlikely we'll ever hear from them again. Perhaps by now, they have realized the consequences of their actions. For cheaters often pay for their actions harshly. Their affair caused them to lose all contact with their daughters. As for us, life has become incredibly sweet. We have built a happy and fulfilling life free from the shadows of infidelity. Our family is full of love and joy, and we treasure every moment we spend together.